Welcome back to our interview series, Israel's Multi-Front Threats, where we examine each of the security challenges facing Israel as it fights to protect its citizens. Today we look at the head of the snake, the epicenter of the threats facing Israel and America in the region, Iran. As we know, Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. The regime has spent decades arming and funding terrorist armies like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, and continues to orchestrate chaos and violence across the region. Iran's use of proxy militias and terror groups to attack American and Israeli forces underscores the urgent need to confront this threat. With us today to talk about Iran is Rich Goldberg. He's the former director for countering Iranian weapons of mass destruction at the White House, and he's now a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Rich, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So Iran has a well-known strategy of using its proxies to attack Americans and Israelis, and we've seen these attacks really been escalating in recent months. What role did Iran play in the October 7th massacre, and where do we see Iran's fingerprints as the war progresses?
Well, let's start with what we know as fact basis going into October 7th. Iran is one of the world's leading state sponsors of terrorism. Hamas is one of those subsidiaries of terror that it funds, equips, coordinates with, directs for all types of tactics and strategies. And of course, we know that the Iranians, through their Revolutionary Guard Corps, have a cell in Beirut where they coordinate amongst several of their proxies for terror activities directed against Israel, not just Hamas, but Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad. Of course, the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, has sort of taken a leadership role in advising the supreme leader in Iran since the death of Qasem Soleimani in 2020. And so you put all of these pieces together. Hezbollah is planning for many, many years of an October 7th type invasion from the north, the possibility of people moving around the region, obviously weapons flows over many years into Gaza. We don't need to be looking for a smoking gun here. Whether or not there was a specific video teleconference from the supreme leader ordering the head of Hamas to start October 7th or not, Iran was behind this over many, many years. And this is unfortunately, sadly, the culmination of Iran's sponsorship of terrorism.
The United States and Israel are both responding to Iranian-backed attacks across the region. But clearly the regime is evading sanctions. It's still able to fund these terror groups, and much of its money comes from oil sales. Iran is exporting millions of barrels of oil per day. How do we cut off the economic engine fueling Iran's terrorism?
Absolutely. And you talk about the fingerprints of Iran throughout the region since October 7th and all this money that is funding this terrorism. It's not just Hamas in Gaza. We talked a little bit just now about Hezbollah, 10 times larger and more lethal of a threat than Hamas ever was, with hundreds of thousands of mortars and rockets and missiles and drones in southern Lebanon to be able to not just create destruction in northern Israel, but even into central Israel and beyond. We've seen the militias funded by Iran in Iraq and Syria. We have 3 dead American soldiers because of those militias already, with many other injured contractors dead as well. We're seeing what the Houthis in Yemen are doing, another proxy of Iran, a client owned and operated for many years by the Islamic Republic, with all kinds of advanced missiles and capabilities, anti-ship ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles fired at southern Israel, drone attacks, and even reports of cutting an undersea cable in the Red Sea. Where is Iran getting all this money? Well, obviously, oil is its top export. We've tried to crack down on Iran's oil exports over many years, and through the ebb and flow of sanctions enforcement and sanctions relief, we have seen Iran send a lot of that oil to China, one of the only actors on earth willing to take the risk of U.S. sanctions and keep importing Iranian oil. Over last summer, perhaps topping 2 million barrels per day of imports. And so it's time for us to see legislation that really cracks down on this flow of oil from Iran to China. How do we do that? There's a piece of legislation called the SHIP Act. It's passed the House, bipartisan in the Senate now. And it would say that if you are in charge of a port in China, if you're any part of the supply chain that's taking this oil off the port, moving it to a refinery, moving it around China, we know who you are. We're going to bring U.S. sanctions down on you. That's going to be a major threat to the Chinese economy. And I think it will get Beijing to act very quickly to curtail these illicit imports.
I'm glad you mentioned the SHIP Act, obviously important legislation that we're focused on, and I want to come back to the legislative angle in just a few moments. Let me ask you about our overall approach to Iran. We often talk about three prongs to the approach: economic pressure, diplomacy, and the credible threat of military force. What does that third piece, the credible threat of military force, look like today?
Well, I think it's been eroded significantly, especially since October 7th. The regime right now is looking out at the chessboard, and I fear that the Ayatollah is less afraid than ever of U.S. power. I think in the days immediately after October 7th, when President Biden sent a second carrier strike group into the region, went to Israel, made clear statements to Tehran and to Hezbollah, I think that actually did make a difference. But over the weeks and months that have followed, we have seen numerous attacks on U.S. forces largely have gone unresponded to until more recently when we lost 3 Americans in Jordan. But even then, and even with all the sustained attacks from the Houthis in Yemen against U.S. Navy forces, international maritime shipping, we have not seen any direct attack against an Iranian official, against IRGC commanders, not just in Iran, but in Iraq or Syria or in Yemen. We remember what happened to our military deterrence, especially on the nuclear front, after the killing of Qasem Soleimani. We really did restore a lot of military deterrence there. I think right now the Iranians don't believe we have the will to use force. That's not just a problem in the regional threat we face in terrorism, it's a major threat on the nuclear front as well.
I'm glad you brought up the nuclear front, and I want to ask you about Iran's nuclear program. First and foremost, how close is Iran to having a nuclear weapon today?
Well, we're just seeing the latest reports circulating from the International Atomic Energy Agency. That's the UN's nuclear watchdog. And they're updating us on how much we know about Iran's nuclear program and all the questions that they won't answer about their nuclear program. Here's what we know. They have decided over the last 3-month period to produce even more high-enriched uranium at 20%, a very high volume. They continue to enrich 60% uranium. They're diluting a little bit down to that 20% level to get some positive PR and avoid increased pressure from the United States and Europe. But in totality, what the IAEA has just told us is that Iran can now make 7 nuclear weapons potentially in 1 month's time if they sought to go to the next step, move to weapons-grade uranium enrichment, and build some sort of crude device that could go boom in the desert. Now, will they take that step? Are they engaged in research and development activities towards building a bomb? Who's behind that? These are questions that we suspect we know, but we don't really know because Iran won't allow inspectors into facilities that are controlled by the SPND, the secret military nuclear organization of Iran that is likely engaged in the research and development towards weaponization. So on the fissile material side, the potential threat of how much nuclear material they have to make a bomb, that continues to get worse by the day. On the weaponization side, what we don't know is what should keep us up at night.
Let's talk about what's at stake here. What would failing to prevent a nuclear Iran mean for America, mean for Israel, and the region at large?
Yeah, I think when you think about energy supplies, economic shipping lanes, when you think about terrorism that threatens United States personnel, U.S. officials, U.S. service members, our allies like Israel, our allies in the Gulf, you're looking at a world today that's already on fire in the Middle East. You would be looking at a fire that's much larger and broader with an inability to respond via conventional means potentially because we would be so deterred by an Iranian nuclear weapon. We cannot allow the anxiety and fear of confrontation over Iran's potential acquisition of a nuclear weapon to allow us to give them permission to build that nuclear weapon. And so understanding what is at stake here. Remember, Iran doesn't just say death to Israel. How does that phrase start? It says death to America, death to Israel. They seek to finally destroy the United States. They seek to export the Islamic Revolution from 1979 beyond their borders. And they have terror proxies that operate on multiple continents capable of carrying out terrorist attacks, assassination plots, and kidnapping plots against U.S. citizens. So in the end, let's get back to basics here. Political pressure economic pressure, and military deterrence, and pass key pieces of legislation I know AIPAC has supported, bipartisan out of the House, the SHIP Act, the No Funds for Iranian Terrorism Act, and the MASA Act to really ratchet up the pressure on this regime.
I want to ask you just a little bit more about those pieces of legislation. You talked about the SHIP Act earlier, other pieces of legislation. What would that MASA Act do? We know Iran continues to violate human rights in Iran itself. Talk to us about that bill and some of the other measures that Congress is looking at and what that would do to combat this threat.
Yeah, one of the missing pieces that we don't talk about enough is one of our greatest assets inside of Iran, and that's the Iranian people. A population largely under the age of 33, people who hate their regime. And that hatred and the despising of that regime was on full display in late 2022 into 2023, when an outright revolution was underway inside the country after the killing of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian who apparently didn't wear her hijab correctly for this extraordinarily radical regime standards. And so in her memory, in her legacy, and thinking of all the other Iranian women who are oppressed on a daily basis, and so many other Iranians who face horrific human rights abuses, this legislation, the MASA Act, would force in law the United States to designate, put sanctions on the supreme leader and other leaders of Iran. Right now, that's only an executive order. And so we need to codify that into law. This is bipartisan, shouldn't be controversial whatsoever to stand with Iranian women and remember what Mahsa Amini meant to that country, and to stop forever more Mahsa Aminis from coming forward by trying to stop what the regime does to its people. Last, the No Funds for Iranian Terrorism Act, another quality piece of bipartisan legislation, seeks to shut down any of the accounts that Iran has around the world that it might be accessing, again, to subsidize all of the horrific fires we see them setting around the Middle East and their nuclear program. This is common sense as well. Freeze those accounts, deny them access to money. An Islamic Republic of Iran with less money is better for U.S. national security.
Important pieces of legislation, and we will continue to reach out to our membership and urge you to contact Congress to support these measures in the coming weeks and months. I want to ask you, Rich, finally about the funding package for Israel. Obviously, this is still being worked out between the House and the Senate, but critical funding that AIPAC members are lobbying for, the $14.3 billion for Israel's security. Maybe spend a moment on the importance of this funding as Israel fights this war.
Yeah, this is hugely important. It's beneficial to U.S. national security as much as to Israel's national security. We're talking about money to ensure Israel has enough interceptors to continue to intercept rockets, not just from Hamas anymore. We've seen their rocket arsenal get largely destroyed and degraded by the IDF these past couple of months, but we're seeing daily attacks from Hezbollah in the north, and we know that their arsenal is more than 10 times larger than Hamas's was. So Israel's going to need more support for the Iron Dome, for David Sling, for other programs in its missile defense architecture. We've seen them use the Arrow missile defense, and I know many of you who are watching spent many years lobbying Congress for supporting that program. It's active. It's working right now to stop the Houthi ballistic missiles coming at Israel. That's going to need to be replenished as well. But most importantly, what we're doing here is sending a message to Iran that we will stand by our ally and that we will stay in this region and deter their aggression, deter their terrorism. It's a message to Nasrallah and Beirut that help is on the way for Israel. Don't ever think about October 7th on the northern border. In fact, we're going to stand up for Israel to ensure that can never happen again.
Rich Goldberg, thank you for being with us today. We'll continue to follow your analysis and your insights in the coming weeks and months. Thank you.
Thank you.
As you just heard, the growing threat from Iran underscores the urgent need to ensure Israel can defend itself by itself. America and all of us have a vital role to play. So take action today by texting the word Israel to 24722 and urge your members of Congress to deliver critical security funding for our ally Israel. That's it for our episode today. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.